Hi, third grade, ready for the next two chapters of the BFG. Today I want you to do two things. I want you to listen for character traits of both our main characters, and I also want you to think about the setting. Both chapters have to do about the setting. And why that is important is because dreams is full of mystery and magic. Do not try to understand them. Roald Dahl from the BFG. Our standards will tell us why they are important. When you ask and you answer questions about the text, you have to think about all of those events in order. And what helps you is to think about the character traits, what they're saying and what they're doing, where they're saying and doing those things. And each event builds upon the earlier sections, and then you can predict what's going to happen. And all of that leads us to third graders should be able to read and comprehend the third grade literature. Today, we have two vocabulary words. Desolate, meaning a place that is depressingly empty or bare, and loomed from chapter 18 appear as a shadowy form. And I'm going to throw a third one in there, and it is a roundabout. Now, up until a few years ago, you might not have known what a roundabout was, but we have several in Olean. And in our chapter, in the setting, it's important, the roundabout, and listen for what the characters are going to do in the roundabout. So get your booklet, chapter 17, Journey to London. How long did it take the BFG and Sophie to get to England? So you need to think about the setting. You're going to be asked to describe what she saw, so listen for all those descriptions. What caused the BFG to become confused? And the third question, how did the BFG get into the Queen's backyard? So I'm excited to hear what's going to happen. Journey to London. A great yellow wasteland lay dim and milky in the moonlight as the big, friendly giant went galloping across it. Sophie, still wearing only her nightie, was reclining comfortably in the crevice of the BFG's right ear. She was actually in the outer rim of the ear near the top, where the edge of the ears fold over. This is the folding over bit that made sort of a roof for her, and it also gave her a wonderful protection against the rushing wind. What is more, she was lying on skin that was soft and warm, almost velvety. Nobody, she told herself, had ever traveled in greater comfort. Sophie peeped over the rim of the ear and watched the desolate landscape of the giant country go whizzing by. They were certainly moving fast. The BFG went bouncing off the ground as though there were rockets in his toes, and each stride he took lifted him about 100 feet up into the air. He had not yet gone into the whizzing top gear of his when the ground became blurred by the speed and the wind howled at his feet, and it seemed to be touching anything but air. That would come later. Sophie had not slept for a long time. She was very tired. She was also warm and comfortable. She dozed off. She didn't know how long she slept, but when she woke up again and looked out over the edge of the ear, the landscape had completely changed. They were in green country now, with mountains and forest. It was still dark, but the moon was shining as brightly as ever. Suddenly, and without slowing his pace, the BFG turned his head sharply to the left. For the first time during the entire journey, he spoke a few words. "Look quick over there," he said, pointing his long trumpet. Sophie looked in the direction he was pointing. Through the murky darkness, all she saw at first was a great cloud of dust about 300 yards away. "Those are the other giants all galloping back from after their guzzle," the BFG said. Then Sophie saw them. In the light of the moon, she saw all 9 of those monstrous, half-naked brutes thundering across the landscape together. They were galloping in a pack, their necks all craned forward, their arms bent at the elbows, and worst of all, their stomachs bulging. The strides they took were incredible. Their speed was unbelievable. Their feet pounded and thundered on the ground and left a great sheet of dust behind them. But in 10 seconds, they were gone. There they were going back. A lot of little girlsies and boysies is no longer sleeping in their beds tonight, the BFG said. Sophie felt quite ill. But this grim encounter made her even more determined to go through with her mission. It must have been about an hour or so later that the BFG began to slow its pace. "We is in England now," he said suddenly. Dark though it was, Sophie could see that they were in a country of green fields with neat hedges in between the fields, and there were hills and trees all over them, and occasionally there were lights with cars on the road, all moving along. Each time they came to a road, the BFG was over and away, and no motorist could possibly ever had seen anything except a black shadow flashing overhead. All at once, a curious orange-colored glow appeared in the night sky ahead of them. "We is coming close to London," the BFG said. He slowed to a trot. He began looking about cautiously. Groups of houses were now appearing on all sides, but there still were no lights in the windows. It was nearly too early for anyone to be getting up. "Someone's bound to see us," Sophie said. "Never is they seeing me," said the BFG confidently. "You was forgetting that I is a doing this thing for years and years. No human being is ever catching up the smallest wink of me." "I did," Sophie whispered. "Ah, yes," he said, "but you was the very first." During the next half hour, things moved so swiftly and silently that Sophie, crouching in the giant's ear, was unable to understand exactly really what was going on. They were in the streets. They were in the houses everywhere. Sometimes they were in shops, and there were bright lamps in the streets, and there were quite a few people about, and there were cars with lights on, but nobody ever noticed the BFG. It was impossible to understand quite how he did it. There was a kind of magic in his movements. He seemed to melt into the shadows. He would glide, that was only the word that she could describe it. It's a way of moving. Glide. He would glide noiselessly from one place to another, always moving, always gliding forward through the streets of London, his black cloak blending in with the shadows of the light. It was quite possible that one or two late-night wanderers might thought they saw a tall black shadow shimmering swiftly down the murky side street, but they never would have believed their own eyes. They would have all dismissed it as an illusion and blamed themselves for seeing things that weren't there. Sophie and the BFG came at last to a large place full of trees. There was a road running through it and a lake. There were no people in this place, and the BFG stopped for the first time since they had set out from his cave many hours before. "What's the matter?" Sophie whispered in her under the breath voice. "I's in a bit of a puddle," he said. "You are doing marvelously," Sophie whispered. "No, I isn't," he said. "I is now completely boggled. I is lost." So remember that question. Why did he become confused? But why? "I completely boggled. I is lost. Because we is meant to be in the middle of London and suddenly we's here in green pastures." "Oh, don't be silly," Sophie whispered. "This is in the middle of London. It's called Hyde Park. I know exactly where we are." "You was joking," he said. "I am not. I swear I'm not. We're almost there." "You mean we is nearly to the Queen's Palace?" cried the BFG. "It's just across the road," Sophie whispered. "This is where I take over." "Which way?" the BFG asked. "Straight ahead." The BFG trotted forward through the deserted park. "Now stop." The BFG stopped. "See that huge roundabout ahead of us just outside the park?" Sophie whispered. "I see it. That is Hyde Park Corner." Even now, when it's still an hour before dawn, there was quite a lot of traffic moving around Hyde Park Corner roundabout. Sophie whispered. "In the middle of the roundabout, there's an enormous stone arch with a statue of a horse rider on top of it. Can you see that? Now think about ours. We have a Christmas tree in the middle of our big roundabout in Olan." The BFG peered through the trees. "I see it," he said. "Do you think that if you took a very fast run at it, that you could jump clean over Hyde Park Corner, over the arch, over the horse and the rider, and land on the pavement on the other side? Easy, the BFG said. Are you sure? Are you absolutely sure? I promise, the BFG said. Whatever you do, you mustn't land in the middle of Hyde Park Corner. Don't get so flushed, the BFG said. To me, that's a snitchy little jump. There's not a tingle-lingle thing to it. Then go, Sophie whispered. The BFG broke into a full gallop. He went scoring across the park, and just before he reached the railings that divided it from the street, he took off. Gigantic leap. He flew across Hyde Park and landed as softly as a cat on the pavement on the other side. Well done, Sophie whispered. Now quick, over that wall. Directly in front of them, bordering the pavement, there was a brick wall with fearsome-looking spikes all along the top of it. A swift crouch, a little leap, and the BFG was over it. We're there, Sophie whispered excitedly. We're in the Queen's garden. All right. So now's the time to stop and think about those 3 questions of how long it took, what caused him to become confused, and then how did he get into her backyard. All right. And now that you've finished, here's our question set for chapter 18. How did Sophie feel at the end of the chapter? What caused her to feel this way? How would you have felt and why? What was the BFG listening for? Why? Describe the Queen's room. So most of these questions are about the setting. So really think about the setting and the description when you hear those. The palace. By gumdrops, whispered the big friendly giant. Is this really it? There's the palace, Sophie whispered back. Not more than 100 yards away, through the tall trees in the garden, across the mown lawns and the tidy flower beds, was the massive palace. It loomed in the darkness. It was made of whitish stone. The sheer size of it staggered the BFG. But this palace is having 100 bedrooms at least, he said. Easy, I should think, she said. Then I boggled, the BFG said. How was I possibly find where the Queen is sleeping? Let's get a bit closer to have a look, Sophie whispered. The BFG glided forward among the trees. Suddenly he stopped dead. A great ear in which Sophie was sitting and began to swivel around. Hey, Sophie whispered. You're going to tip me out. Shh, the BFG whispered back. I hear something. He stopped behind a clump of bushes. He waited. The ear was still swinging this way and that. Sophie had to hang on tight to the side to save herself from tumbling out. The BFG pointed through the gap in the bushes. There, and not more than 50 yards away, was a man paddling softly across the lawn. He had a guard dog with him on a leash. The BFG stayed as still as a stone. So did Sophie. The man and the dog walked on and disappeared out into the darkness. You was telling me there was no soldiers here. He wasn't a soldier, Sophie whispered. He was some sort of watchman. We'll have to be careful. I's not too worried, the BFG said. These waxy ears of mine has been picking noise even of a man breathing on the other side of this garden. How much longer before it's light? Sophie asked. Very short, the BFG said. We must be pell-mell for leather now. Think of that saying. I've never heard of that. Pell-mell of leather now. So that must mean there's no time to waste. They must do this hurriedly. He glided forward through the vast garden, and once again Sophie noticed how he seemed to melt into the shadows wherever he went. His feet made no sound at all, even when he was walking on the gravel. Suddenly, they were right up close against the back wall of the great palace. The BFG's head was level with the upper windows, and he peered in. There were no lights showing anywhere. In the distance, they could hear the muted sounds of the traffic going around Hyde Park roundabout. The BFG stopped and put out his other ear. Sophie wasn't sitting in close to the first window. No, he whispered. What are you listening for? She said. For breathing, the BFG whispered. I'm able to tell if this man is a human being or a lady being, all by the breathing. He glided on, flattened his tall, thin black coat against the building. He listened. Nope, he said and moved on. The room is empty. He listened to several more windows, but at each one he just shook his head and moved on. When he came to the window in the very center of the palace, he listened but did not move on. Ho, ho, he whispered. We has a lady sleeping in there. Sophie felt a little quiver running down her spine. But who? She whispered back. The BFG put a finger to his lips for silence. He reached through the open window and parted the curtain ever so slightly. The orange glow from the night sky over London crept into the room and cast a glimmer of light onto its walls. It was a large room, a lovely room, rich carpet, gilded chairs, a dressing table, a bed, and on the pillow of the bed lay the head of a sleeping woman. For a few seconds, she was speechless. Sophie suddenly found herself looking at the face she had seen on the stamps and coins and in the newspaper all her life. Is that her? BFG whispered back. Yes, Sophie whispered. The BFG then wasted no time. First, and very carefully, he started to raise the lower half of the large window. The BFG was an expert on windows. He had opened thousands of them over the years to blow his dreams into the children's bedrooms. Some creaked, and he was pleased to find that the queen's window slid up easy as silk. He pushed the lower half as far as he could to leave a place for Sophie to sit. Next, he closed the crack in the curtains. Then, with his finger and thumb, he lifted Sophie out of his ear and he placed her on the window ledge with her legs dangling just inside the room, but still behind the curtains. Now, don't you go toppling backwards, the BFG whispered. You must always be holding on tight with both hands and inside the windowsill. Sophie did as he said. It was summertime in London, and the night was not cold, but don't forget that Sophie was still only wearing her thin nightgown. She would have given anything for a dressing gown, not just to keep her warm, but to hide the whiteness of the nightie from the watchful eyes of the garden below. The BFG was taking the glass jar out of the pocket of his cloak. He unscrewed the lid. Now, very cautiously, he poured the precious dream into the wide end of his trumpet. He steered the trumpet through the curtains and far into the room, aiming at the place where he knew the bed to be. Then he took a deep breath. He puffed out his cheeks and he blew. Now he was withdrawing the trumpet, sliding it very carefully like a thermometer. Is you all right sitting there? He whispered to Sophie. Yes, she murmured. She was quite terrified, but determined not to show it. She looked down over her shoulder. The ground seemed miles away. It was a nasty drop. How long will the dream work? Sophie whispered. Sometimes takes an hour, he whispered. Sometimes quicker, sometimes slower, but it's sure to find her in the end. Sophie said nothing. I is a going off to wait in the garden, the BFG whispered. When you is a wanting me, just call out my name and I'll come quick. Will you hear me? Sophie whispered. You was forgetting these, the BFG whispered, and smiling and pointing to his huge ears. Goodbye, Sophie whispered. Suddenly and unexpectedly, the BFG leaned forward, kissed her gently on the cheek. Sophie felt like crying. When she turned back to look at him, he was already gone. He had simply melted away into the dark garden. Oh, so they've made it now to the Queen's palace. The dream has been let in her room through the trumpet. And Sophie's going to sit there and watch this happen. So I can't wait to read the next chapter, actually, two with Miss Batome. So take your time answering your questions. Think about again the setting as I was reading it to you. And think also about the character of the BFG and how the relationship between Sophie and the big friendly giant has evolved. It's getting stronger. He just did something that was pretty important in the story right before he left. So be sure to upload these, and we can't wait to find out what's going to happen with the Queen.